The first scream was swallowed by the ocean. It arrived already fragmented, a thin bright thing like a dropped glass, and the sea took it without ripple, as if it had been waiting to receive that sound for a very long time. Annie heard it from the seaplane as the pilot nosed down over vapory water and the island unfolded. Sable cliffs, a fringe of white sand, a scatter of buildings that did not look like architecture so much as careful placements, like offerings. She felt the scream as a small subsonic tug in her chest, and for a moment she mistook the tug for a reaction the public would have given to her absence, a collective gasp that might prove her worth. Then the plane angled and the sound was gone, as if the sea had taken more than noise. The pilot's jaw tightened. A woman in a scarf across the aisle pinched at her sleeve and then looked away. No one spoke. "What am I doing here?" Annie asked the question aloud before she had decided whether it was directed at the pilot, the woman in the scarf, or the island itself. The words felt ridiculous and necessary in equal measure, an admission and a dare. She had not meant to say them aloud. They left her mouth like a contraband currency. She had come to Elysian Cove because the brand managers had called it a sanctuary, because the paparazzi had been promised distance, and the social contracts of scandal required a place with no press gates, no helicopter pads crowded by microphones. She had come because anonymity was being sold in glossy brochures as cleanly as bottled water, because the word retreat had become a bargain. The island's website was a patient thing, no testimonials, no raucous color palettes, only soft sentences about gentle seclusion and curated privacy. When the seaplane landed and the ladder was lowered, she stepped out into a wind the color of lead, and the attendants wore linen and moved like practiced ritual. A man in a jacket with a name tag that read Adi Val led her up a short ramp. He had the manager's tidy shrug and the expression of someone who had learned how to keep colleagues' anxieties at a distance. He said, "Welcome, Ms. Laurent," and his voice was thin with obligation. Annie had constructed herself on stages, in hotel suites and press rooms that smelled of coffee and elevator ozone. She could recollect every light and every laugh with a clarity that sometimes made her feel like someone walking ahead of her own life. Fame had been a slow erosion. The applause that used to fill her had atrophied the space that sat behind her eyes. She kept lists in her head of what audiences needed next, and what they would never give back. The scandal that had precipitated the retreat was a simple tableau. An accusation, a photograph, a rumor that magnified into a smear across every morning show. But the private wear lasted long after headlines cooled. She had been reduced in public to the hollow part of her. Friends had counseled escape. So the plane, the island, the beige robe handed to her by a woman who had moved like a whisper. These were stepwise remedies. Still, standing on the boardwalk, the question returned. Without an audience to calibrate herself against, she felt small and raw. The island took her photograph in a way she had never anticipated. Not with lenses, but with attention, like a person who was learning the curves of her face. The attendant offered a brief tour in hushed tones, explaining the hours of dinner and the rule about the northern shore being closed after dusk. Annie nodded, more to see what the island would offer than because she wanted to accept any of the rules. Her room opened onto a veranda that looked out toward a small crescent of black sand. There were seafoam linens and a linen robe folded on a chair, an arrangement of local shells and a note in dark ink. Elysian prides itself on discretion. Annie stood at the window and watched the ocean, feeling herself at once exposed and invisible. Somewhere inside her a tame and brittle hope flickered. Perhaps solitude would sit kindly on her. Night arrived early on the island, as if the air itself were prepared to shorten the day. It was a close night, humid, with the sodium light from the path posts softening like a bruise. She was trying to read when the first knock sounded. Hard, deliberate against the glass of the veranda door. It was a single staccato that felt out of scale with the gentle household. Annie started, then went to the door, believing it would be one of the attendants who had been given instructions to check on new arrivals. There was nothing there, only the sheen of water on the wood and a small, wet footprint at the base of the door. It was childlike, short, the toes spread as if someone had stood on the threshold and looked in. She pressed a palm to the glass and felt the damp cold of the veranda. And then the second knock came, from somewhere along the corridor of the resort. 3 short raps, like a code. The noise traveled as if along a seam in the building, and then dissipated into the night's other sound. A distant surf, the muttering of insects. She laughed because it was her only tool against the sudden disquiet. It was irrational to feel unnerved by a footprint and taps, yet the island seemed to multiply small things into motifs. The attendants reassured her with practiced calm. Adrian Vale, arranged a meal for her, explained that sometimes local wildlife left prints, that the tides could throw up foreign things. He spoke without condescension, but with a measured distance that felt like a man who had been trained in these comforts and who had learned to offer them without getting tangled. In the morning, he showed her the map of the island, wine stains and notes in the margins, the main house, the cottages, the northern cove. He would, he said, be available if she needed anything. There was a staff member named Lila who sat beside the koi pond with a cigarette tucked from a pocket and who offered more than hospitality. She offered gossip. Lila had been on the island for 3 years and could list guest departures and arrivals like entries in a ledger. She spoke of a honeymoon couple who left hand in hand but stopped speaking to one another within days. She spoke of a yoga teacher who had taken to walking the beaches at dawn and had eventually been sent home for unwellness. And she said, in a voice that had the casual cruelty of someone cataloguing the island's demand, "People come here carrying holes, and the island likes to see what fits." Annie listened. She was not immune to stories designed to bind her to a place the way a reader is bound to a book. The island had a catalogue of absences, Lila said, and it liked to find matching shapes. The first few days were a collage of small, pleasant misalignments with what Annie expected. There were meals of local fish served on plates so white their color felt like an erasure. There was a scent of citrus and salt that grew familiar. There were afternoons where the staff left her alone at perfectly timed intervals, giving her a deliberate solitude that seemed both polite and studied. Cameras were sparse. There were no drones. She floated through time with a loosened sense of herself, sometimes measuring her heartbeat against the rhythm of the surf, as if it were a metronome that might remind her how long she had been alive. Yet the small, eerie things continued. There were times the corridor lights would fail for a moment, and in the dark there would be a faint white smear across the security monitors in the lobby, a filmic white that crawled across the frames like fog. On 2 occasions, she awoke from a nap to hear 3 knocks timed perfectly. Knock, 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 in the pattern that the attendants later named the sequence. When she opened the door, there were, always, a smudge of damp, a child-sized footprint, or nothing at all. The island staff offered explanations with the same flat eloquence. The tide, a mischievous animal. The explanations were soothing, and at the same time they left a residue of dissatisfaction in her. The world had become a place where answers were given like bandages. She began to notice the way staff watched guests with a patience that did not belong to kindness. Their eyes were trained to notice subtleties. A hand that trembled too long, a laugh that landed late, a gaze that avoided meeting. When she walked the path to the small library, she found them leaning in doorways, their presence like punctuation. On a night when storm clouds threatened beyond the horizon, she followed Adrian to the security room where he said he would show her something of the island. He hesitated at the threshold, hand on the doorframe, and his expression softened in a way he tried to hide. The security room was a dim place filled with monitors, like eyes within a shrine. The feeds were a collage of the island, Lobbies and corridors, cut-out gardens, stretches of beach. The screens made the resort look like a film set. Adrian moved with the familiarity of a man who had memorized the map of this place, the way another might recall a child's face. He pulled up a handful of clips, pointing at moments where the white smear had tracked across the lenses, at times when the audio would cut out and then return carrying a low-frequency undernote like a bell. There was a clip from the Northern Cove at dusk. The feed began with an empty frame, the camera's timestamp glancing in the lower corner. In the middle of the image, something moved, a pale curve against the dark, like a face catching the light. It was not immediately recognizable as human. The clip stalled, then flickered, and a smear of white washed across the screen. When the image returned, there was a face, pale and patient, smiling in a way that suggested the memory of a smile more than the thing itself. It looked, for a moment, like recognition. Adrian's hand hovered near the mouse, and for a breath he said, "We've had guests see strange things." The way he said it carried less fear than the weariness of someone who had held too many small panics and had seen them dissolve into the routine of hosting. Annie watched the monitor and felt, with a clarity that shocked her, that the face on the screen was looking at her. She could not explain the sensation. The clip was archival, recorded days before her arrival. The smile on the face was patient and reserved, like a person who waits. It did not leer or lunge. It merely contained the possibility of attention, and that possibility landed on Annie like a weight that was not heavy, but essential. For the first time since she had stepped off the seaplane, she felt the island's gaze settle on her. And the question, "What am I doing here?" took on another tone. It began to mean something inward, rather than logistical. It meant, what hole were you bringing that needed filling? What hunger did you bring with you that might be legible to a place whose business was noticing absence? She retreated from the monitors with the odd, flushed sensation of someone who has been seen at a place where they had intended to be anonymous. That night, there was another knock. This time it came not at the glass, but at her door. 3 concise, measured taps, as if accented by a conductor. She opened the door to the veranda and found only that same child-sized footprint, press of wet on wood. But pressed nearby, half buried in the damp of the step, was something new. A small white shell threaded on a frayed cord, like a token left by a visitor. It had been placed with the intentfulness of an offering. She picked it up, and it smelled faintly of salt, and something else she could not name. The island, Annie thought, kept a ledger. It recorded absent shapes and returned to them with tokens. Lila told Annie a story about the old woman who lived on the shore beyond the resort's official property. The woman, she said, was a keeper of tongue and tide. She would sit near the rocks and sort shells into patterns. Once, Lila said, the old woman had told her, "The sea remembers absence." The phrase lodged itself in Annie's mind with the stubbornness of a proverb. It sounded like something with lessons both tender and punitive. Annie imagined the sea as a vast hush that collected the world's missing things, promises, faces, names, echoes. The sentence suggested that absence had weight and memory, which was both consoling and terrifying. Her days became a study in micro-anomalies. She would find the same shell moved from the chair by the veranda to the bathroom ledge. Never a finger's smear. No note of when or by whom. Once she woke to discover 3 knocks tapping the glass, and beyond the window, the pale outline of a figure standing at a distance on the sand, watching. When she opened the door, it was empty, but there were prints leading toward the water, small, childlike, and receding into the surf as if the shore had accepted them. The motif repeated itself as if someone were rehearsing a message in a language she only half understood. She took to watching the island in return. She would sit at the library's big windows and observe the guests. A honeymooning couple who shared silence like another kind of intimacy. A man who read newspapers and tracked the weather. A woman who spent afternoons arranging the same bouquet of wildflowers and then removing them at dusk. There was a rhythm here that had its own traffic. The island's rituals, the 9 o'clock hush where guests were expected to be in their rooms, the morning shell walkers who drifted like ritualized pilgrims, scanning the rackline for meaning. People changed subtly under the island's watch. Voices grew quieter. Laughter lost some of its outer edges. Smiles softened into a private curiosity. Adrian had a story he told at odd intervals, a fragment of something he would never fully commit to. When he was young, he'd worked boats along these coasts with his father, learning tides the way others learned prayers. His father had been practical with a superstition that had no single language. He left marks on the hulls and names on the logs. Adrian's family was not native to the island but had served it for generations in small practical ways, fixing docks, running lines, smoothing disagreements among guests. The job at Elysian Cove had once been administrative. Over time it had become stewardship. He had the look of a man who had been the island's interpreter rather than its owner. He could not unsee certain patterns and neither could he speak them in a way that would settle them. "You should not go to the northern shore alone at night," he told her once, near the staff kitchen, where the light was faint and the coffee was always reheated. He said it with the tone of someone offering a warning that was part local superstition and part liability notice. "Why not?" she asked, willing him to answer fully. He shrugged, an old habit translating into a tired smile. "It remembers things there. People have always said this place collects." He didn't say collects what, and she appreciated the restraint. Names were busy things that invited explanation. She wanted answers anyway. She wanted to map causality like a board with pins and strings. The island denied such tidy reasoning. A staff member, Thomas, left abruptly one afternoon. He had been at the resort for 2 seasons and was known for his quiet humor. He came by to tell Annie that he was going home. His eyes were ringed like someone who had slept badly for months. "It's nothing sinister," he told her, but his hands were folded too tightly for a casual message. He offered a story about his mother needing him, about the city to which he was returning. But the way he left his sentence hovering made it clear his reasons were as porous as many of the island's explanations. When questioned by guests, the management had phrased his departure as personal matters. Annie felt a calculated opacity. She began to collect such moments like seashells, classifying into piles meant to provide coherence. She started keeping a small notebook, not for the usual celebrity travel notes, but to map occurrences, times, small symbols, people's reactions. Her handwriting grew angular. She wrote 3 knocks, with increasing regularity, and circled the phrase. Once, she recorded the smudge across a monitor, writing the timestamp, 03-12-08, as if the inclusion of digits would shore the phenomenon from subjectivity into record. The security room seemed like the island's archive. The monitors held 1,000 hours of its small rituals, all displayed in grey resolution. But every time she tried to digest the footage for meaning, the frames would blur or white out, as if resisting comprehension. There was a morning when she found a child's painting tucked under her door. It was a naive little thing, 2 stick figures on a blue wash, a sun with too many rays. Someone had scrawled at the bottom, in a hand that was not quite adult and not quite child, a 2-word sentence, "Home, please." The ink had bled a little at the edges as if the paper had been damp. She held the paper up to the light and thought of the old woman's proverb. The sea remembers absence. The painting read like an offering or a plea. She left a small reply on the same sheet, because reply felt like the right human motion, in a situation that thinned the air with unreality. Who left this? She pressed the paper into the corridor and waited. 2 hours later, Adrian found her and handed the paper back folded at the edge. He did not ask whether anyone else had left it. Sometimes guests leave things by accidents. Children visit with fishermen on the mainland. The island is porous. For a moment his eyes lingered on the painting in a way that suggested he possessed a store of knowledge he did not want to admit. The pattern, for Annie, developed into an uneasy fascination. She began to move through the island as a person chasing an arrangement of signs. She walked the shore at dawn with a pair of binoculars and watched the surf for figures. Once, beyond a low ridge of black rocks, she saw someone standing hip-deep in the water, pale, still, facing the sea. When she approached, the person was gone, but on the rocks there was a neat ring of shells arranged like offerings. She took a photo, and later, when reviewing it on her phone, the image would sometimes blur and sometimes show a furtive white wash across the frame. Technology refused to be her ally here. The island had an economy of erasure. Within 2 weeks, she had become something between an investigator and an addict. She would ask the staff questions in ways that disguised the hunger. Has anyone ever been different after a visit? Do guests ever refuse to leave? She wanted a roster of symptoms so she could diagnose herself. Lila told her a story of a guest who left and later returned to the mainland with a tenacious habit of arranging shells in the margins of his bills. The story was plausibly ornamental and chilling at once. One evening, in the dining room where lanterns made the tables look like browned maps, the honeymoon couple sat in near silence. The man's hand hovered near the woman's in a manner that suggested restraint rather than tenderness. They ate slowly, spoke slowly. Later, Annie watched them sitting apart on the veranda, neither touching, both watching the horizon as if it were a film that might reveal a missing frame. Their distance spoke of something carved out between them, an absence in which the island had staked a small claim. She thought often of risk, and of what she would trade for being attended to. There was the curious private thought that the island was offering a thing she had always believed impossible, to be fully met. She wondered whether any human could be content with that kind of attention if it required the surrender of certain private dimensions. The temptation was an unwelcome warmth, a filling that promised to make the hollowness stop echoing. And yet, there were nights when the island merely practiced its patience. There were times the monitors returned nothing but the sweep of waves, and the attendants kept their calm as if an unseen order demanded it. Adrian kept his distance, eyes tracking lines on a map. Instead of full confession, he offered lithe fragments. He told her of the island's old caretakers, people who had in local myth bartered tokens with the sea. He said the island had been known to fishermen as a collector, and his face softened when he used the word. It doesn't take in any crude way, he said. It learns. It remembers what is missing and curates. The island's curating was not violent. It did not shout. It offered itself like a companion to an absence, a place where the missing could sit and be recognized. Sometimes such recognition could be necessary. The language of need and the manner of answering need were two different things. Annie felt them both. Her nights grew populated by small hauntings. Once she dreamed of standing on the northern beach while the tide lifted a chorus of small bones that arranged themselves into an altar of precise geometry. She woke with her lips tasting of salt and the feeling of a smile not her own on her face. At breakfast the next morning, there was talk among staff of the altar, and a table of tourists whispered about a local fisherman's superstition. Later, in the library, she found photographs in an older guest book, a sequence of sepia shots showing a rough stone heap on the northern shore, an offering of sorts, bits of animal bone, well-worn shells, a small pendant made of some pale material. A guest had captioned one page with the absurdly neutral comment, "Someone is keeping memory." Annie's curiosity hardened into resolve. She began to attend to the island's rituals rather than skim them. She learned when the 9 o'clock hush began, when the staff made their brief rounds, when the guests walked into the low light and folded like paper. She sat in the kitchen once and watched a staff meeting where the subject of certain guests came up. The management framed their concern as procedural. A housekeeping lead named Mara coughed and said, "They come for privacy and end up wanting company. Sometimes it's the same hunger." The remark landed on an emotional seam, an economic and spiritual appetite. The island's aesthetic of gentle restraint irritated her. It felt like a luxury of control, to do away with spectacle and replace it with ritual that would wear a guest thin. And yet the island did not appear cruel. Even its small predations were disguised as care. A shell left on a bedside, a teaspoon placed on the left instead of the right. The attention was tempting. The island's gestures were designed to be read as affection. One rain-sodden afternoon, Adrian took her in a small car up to the ridge beyond the resort. The path narrowed and the plants pressed with a wet, green hunger. He drove in silence and she watched his knuckles on the wheel, his jaw working as if decisions were being gnawed at there. In the small cottage at the ridge, they sat opposite one another, and for the first time his voice loosened enough to be personal. "My father kept a ledger," he said. "Not a book that anyone read, just a list of things that went missing in the village. He would cross them off when he thought they'd been found. I used to think that was quaint. Then I started keeping an eye on the shore. Things happen there. People change." "Change how?" she asked, and the straightforwardness of the question made him smile sadly. "Sometimes people come back different," he said. "Sometimes they leave part of themselves there. I can't tell you more than that, Annie. I'm not allowed to make declarations." It was an admission wrapped in policy. He looked at her then, and there was a human plea in the steadiness of his eyes. "Don't make this worse. Worse." The island's patience contained a constant decision: to offer attention, to accept, to wait. For Annie, waiting had been the root of many losses. Her career had taught her to react, to preempt. Here, the island asked her to surrender to time in a fashion she had not been taught. That, perhaps, was the worst thing it could ask of someone trained to be seen on a schedule. She tried to keep a distance by reasoning. She recorded the times of anomalies, copied snippets of security footage to her encrypted file, sent an email to an old friend who had once been an investigative journalist. He replied with questions meant to pull her back into a frame of rational curiosity. "Are you sure it's not a camera malfunction? Are you sure the staff are not staging things to create atmosphere? Tell me about maintenance logs." Her replies became thinner. Some of the footage in her cache showed only the white smear and nothing else. Some of it showed the pale, smiling face at the edge of a frame, patient in its geometry, and then the image would stutter and lose the face or wash it clean as if the camera had involuntarily blinked. In the printed notes of a maintenance log, she found an entry that read, 0312-08, camera glitch, rechecking feed. Another line, handwritten, said, "Guest reported disturbance." The handwriting was not Adrian's. The interplay between recorded evidence and lived experience began to erode her sense of the possible. Sometimes she would stand by the windows and call out into the night, half hoping a voice would call back and half hoping nothing would happen. The question, the title that had lodged itself in her as both complaint and demand, resounded differently each dawn. Fear Island. What am I doing here? At first it was about logistics. Now it was about the possibility that she had arrived with a hole and the island had sat ready with the means to befriend that hollow. The thought was intoxicating and appalling. A peculiar thing happened one evening when she decided to test the island's patience. She took a lantern and walked toward the north, following a path that narrowed into scrub and then opened into a stretch of sand. The sea that night was a flat black mirror. The world had set itself to listen. She walked until she could no longer see the dim glitter of the resort behind her. Then she stopped. There were other lights in the dark, small, pale figures standing in the surf like statues newly animated. They turned toward her with a patience that was unfathomable. Each face was coated in a kind of patient smile. Annie felt her name speak itself in her ears, not as sound, but as pressing thought. "You are Hollow." The sense of recognition was intimate and sudden. She thought of the smile she had seen in the monitor in the security room and understood, with the sharpness of someone waking, that the island was not only a place, but a listener. She did not go further that night. She retreated as if the sea itself had drawn back. Back at the resort, the attendants moved like people who had learned to perform calm. Adrian found her at the doorway and put his hand on her shoulder in a manner that was both managerial and caring. "You should not be alone out there," he said. "Why not?" Her voice came smaller than she intended. "Because it remembers," he said simply. "Because people who go there sometimes don't come back the same." He did not say more. Annie nodded, as if the answer was sufficient, though the words left her unsatisfied. The island's language refused to be wholly translated. Over the coming days, the pattern intensified. Guests volunteered small haikus about the beauty of the place. Staff arranged flowers into circles and then left them to the tide. The 3 knocks became a sequence she could predict, sometimes at night, sometimes at mid-afternoon, and always accompanied by the discovery of a small wet footprint near some threshold. Each time she found one, a human portion of her hoped against hope that the foot belonged to a child from a passing fishing boat. Another, thornier part of her wondered whether the island left them placed as tokens. Then, in the security room, Adrian hesitated and pulled up a file he'd been reluctant to show. "I haven't shown this to anyone," he said. "We've archived it." The feed was old, grainy, time-stamped a year prior. The camera framed the northern cove at dusk. The white smear crept across the screen like a shroud, and then resolved briefly into the pale face she had seen before. This time the face seemed to tilt, and for a half-second its mouth opened into something like recognition. Then the image stuttered, and when it returned, the frame contained nothing but the rustle of sea. Annie's breath caught. The screen showed a presence that knew how to wait. She felt for a moment, the exact moment the screen blinked, as if the island had understood the shape of her emptiness. The feeling was deer-light and enormous. It was also intolerable. She sat with the footage until the lamps in the security room went out and Adrian's shape at the console softened into the dark. When she left, the corridors felt like a ship at anchorage, gentle, with an undercurrent. She imagined the watchers beyond the rim of darkness, patient as old machinery. On her pillow that night she whispered the question again, this time like a mantra. "Fear Island. What am I doing here?" The words did not feel like an interrogation of distance. They felt like an internal inventory. In the morning, beneath her door, there was another small thing. A ring of tiny white shells laid out in a precise circle, and, in the center, a single, wet smear like the trace of a thumb. The pattern could have been accidental. It could have been deliberate. She folded the shells into the pocket of her robe and walked to breakfast as if carrying a secret. Around the table, guests spoke in the thin civility of people who were watching each other's manners carefully. Every so often someone would glance at her with an expression that combined curiosity and pity. She wanted to apologize for being enthralled with mysteries. She wanted to explain that what the island offered was attention, and that attention was a currency she had spent and badly managed. Around mid-morning, Adrian found her alone on the library steps and said quietly, "There are stories told on the shore by fishermen, stories of people who leave and then never quite come back. Not in the dramatic sense. They go on, but with a footprint missing from somewhere inside. Sometimes they come back to the city and place a shell on their mantle without remembering why. Sometimes they stop answering certain friends." "Is it always permanent?" she asked, the rationalism of her training asserting itself. "There are good recoveries," he said. And there are recoveries that don't look like what you'd expect. It takes different shapes. She thought about shapes, about hollows filling themselves, about the traded economy of who gave and who received. She felt like an object in negotiation. The island watched and curated and offered not only the brush of attention, but the possibility of being remade. She wanted to be remade. She wanted the ache in her ribs to stop echoing. She wanted to be satiated. The knowledge felt like a cliff edge she wanted to peer over. A week later, late in the afternoon when a storm was promised but had not yet declared itself, she overheard the housekeeper whispering about an altar found at the northern cove. The word altar made everything sound more ritual, more official. There was a small crew that had gone down with flashlights and found a precise arrangement of bones, bird vertebrae, the white wash of small ribs, set in a ring. Someone had added small shells and a pendant, a pale disc threaded on twine. A guest had photographed it and posted anonymously in a travel forum with a neutral caption. Found something on the North Shore. Replies ranged from superstition to mockery. Annie held the photograph in her hands and felt the air thin. The bones were clean, arranged with an economy that suggested intention rather than cruelty. It read like a shrine assembled by hands that practiced patience. It was not violent, it was curated. The island was a patient collector of pieces. That night she dreamed of being offered a glass of water that tasted like everything she had ever wanted and never received. She nearly took the glass in her sleep, then jerked awake with the sense that someone had smiled at her, as if at an old acquaintance. In the morning there were messages from friends, polite reminders that her return to the city would be scheduled soon. There were also the small anomalies, another white smear in a video clip, a monitor feed where faces blurred into the salt. At breakfast, a television in the common room played a quiet stream of an interview about islands that had cultural practices of collecting. The segment lingered on certain myths, the local seam between memory and place. Annie thought of the monitor face and how recognition could be itself a hazard. She booked an extra night, then another. The questions, she realized, had nested into her like seeds. She was not there out of logistical convenience anymore. She was there because the island had noticed her. The idea made her dizzy. She wanted to flee and also to stay until the island had finished cataloging the parts of her it found absorbable. One evening, while rain traced somatic patterns on the windows, Annie found herself following Lila into the staff quarters, where a small group of attendants had gathered to pass time. The room was crowded with chatter and cigarettes, and the kind of intimacy that forms when people share a slow labor. A young man named Thomas, whom she had watched leave in pieces, was not present. A woman she did not know told a story about guests who left behind playlists on playback devices, songs that then spoke for them. The narrative threads of the island wound tighter and carried a strange music. At the edge of the staff's conversation, a man named Felipe, who had been a maintenance tech for years, said almost offhand, "It watches the way we stack things. When we adjust a chair, it notices. When we fold a towel wrong, it keeps a memory of the crease." The room laughed softly. Folk humor. But Annie noticed the way Felipe's fingers rubbed one another, as if he were trying to erase something that might not be meant to be rubbed out. As the days lengthened, so did the list of small evidences. A guest who had been notably brittle left the resort mid-morning with a very small, contented smile she had not seen before. A toddler visiting with a fisherman ran through the halls, leaving wet footprints, and a cleaner found, by the end of the day, a trail of such prints leading to a closed door that no child could have opened. The island kept collecting and arranging, and sometimes the collected items bled into the guests' lives in quiet ways. A necklace found in a pocket, a changed habit, a letter never written. Annie learned to read the island like a text. It was possible to interpret patterns and yet impossible to close the book. She learned in small, humbling measures to accept that some things resisted explanation. Sometimes the best a person could do was to witness what was there, and yet the island made promises that were both explicit and absurd. Its marketing became quietly prolific. A single advertisement appeared in a glossy magazine, a photograph of a veranda opening toward water, and the caption, in a voice that could have been anywhere, "A place to come home to yourself." Tourists called and asked if the northern shore was accessible. People wrote vacation blogs about the cove and made jokes about being collected by a place. The island smiled politely at the attention and then returned to its rituals. At the midpoint of her stay, an event that would later feel like an axis, Annie returned to the security room. She had, by that time, taken to watching the monitors in the raw, more out of a desire to be in the scene than to find firm answers. Adrian was there, alone at his console. He turned the screen to her and for the first time did not hesitate before showing a file. The image flicked into view. A frame she had not seen, time-stamped 2 weeks before her arrival. The face on the monitor turned its head very slightly, and for the slimmest instant of media, its expression widened into a smile that felt full of recognition. It was the same smile she had half seen in earlier clips, but now it was framed differently. The eyes seemed to drink in the camera's angle, the way a person drinks in a beloved's face. For a fraction of a second, she felt the iron click of being noted in a place that had no business noticing her. "You see what I mean," Adrian said. His voice had fatigue threaded through it, and an urgency she had not noticed before. He had the look of a man tired of being the island's buffer. Annie sat there and realized with a clarity that was almost physical that the island's attention seated itself where there was room. The recognition on the face was not a threat in an not entirely hostile way. It was an appraisal. Recognition had the gravity of a furnished room. It measured what fit and what did not. For days after that, the feeling of being catalogued sat under Annie's skin like a name on the back of a neck. She moved through the resort with the furtive attention of someone who has been noticed in a crowd and cannot decide whether to bow or run. The monitors offered partly formed answers and left the rest to climate and superstition. Adrian began to speak around facts, not into them, and Annie learned to notice that the island's restraint was itself an act. She started to keep a second list, one of small concessions. Shells that moved from place to place, towels folded the wrong way, a teaspoon left on the opposite side of a saucer. These were minor things, almost gentle, but their accumulation felt like a slow architecture of attention built around her life. On a wet afternoon, she found a slip of paper tucked under the robe on her chair. A single word written in a child's unsteady script, contain. No signature, no explanation. The word felt both like an instruction and a mercy. It is one thing to be observed from afar, and another to be invited toward a remedy. Annie thought of remedies she had accepted in public, apologies recited into cameras, charity photographs, wardrobe changes, and how little those had touched the hollow inside her ribs. The island's gestures felt more intimate. They were small offerings that suggested someone elsewhere had taken inventory and chosen items to return. Her appetite for the island's mysteries shifted toward something less clinical and more yearning. She read the guestbook entries with an intensity bordering on devotion, a typed review that praised the silence, a handwritten note thanking the staff for their kindness, a hurried scrawl in which someone had written, "I came here to stop missing myself." That sentence was marginal and raw. Annie underlined it twice and pressed it between pages of her notebook. Late one evening, Adrian came to her with 2 cups of tea and a map that had been heavily annotated. His hands trembled in a way that made his control feel like a veneer. "My father used to draw tide lines in the margins," he said, voice low. "He would mark days when boats returned with fewer crates, when nets had fewer fish. He said the sea keeps a ledger of people too. It is not just for fish. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. Did he? She began, but the question in her throat opened into something unclassifiable. Did he lose people to the shore? Did he watch the island take? Adrian shook his head. He would never say it took. He would say people left pieces of themselves out there. I suppose there is a difference. He told her then, in fits and starts, something of his own entanglement with the place. When he was younger, he had wanted to leave the coast and make a name elsewhere. But the island had a way of anchoring people, jobs that promised a rhythm, acquaintances that became kin, a quiet gravity. There were times I nearly left, he said. Then something small would happen. A guest would find a long-lost locket on the shore, or a fisherman would come and put down a tray of baked bread, and I would stay. The island keeps the kinds of returns that make leaving feel unnecessary. He laughed without heat. I tell myself its story. It keeps the night quieter. Annie listened, and in the listening she catalogued her own longings and compromises. Her career had taught her to accept transactional comforts, an apology here, a hired smile there, and to treat public affection like currency that can be spent and regained. This place offered a different commerce, attention in exchange for silence, recognition in exchange for something less definable. She felt parts of herself tilt toward that bargain. The watches began to encroach on her nights. Dreams and wakefulness braided together until she could not tell which was which. She would awaken certain that the 3 knocks had come from the veranda, that the child-sized prints were at her door, that a small shell had been placed on her pillow. Sometimes these things were there when she rose. Sometimes they were not. The island practiced a cruelty that was precise, never enough to frighten into flight, always enough to invite staying. A minor crisis occurred when a teenage guest, an awkward boy who had been on a family trip, began to ask questions that could not be mollified with a staff smile. He had been overheard one night on the veranda, whispering to the sea a list of names. The boy's parents were anxious, and soon the story reached a national forum where vacationers speculated about the island's eccentricities. A blogger posted an edited clip of cameras showing a smear of white, and the caption, "Weird Night at Cove." The management issued a statement that same afternoon. Elysian Cove is committed to guest privacy and safety. The resort would cooperate with any inquiries. The online conversation flared, then cooled into routine commentary. For Annie, the episode proved that the island could be made to fit a corporate-friendly narrative. It could also refuse to be contained. It was in the lull that preceded the storm that Lila confided in Annie an oral record that had the quality of legend made practical. They were sitting by the koi pond, the sky a smooth grey sheet, and a thin salt wind scraped the pond surface into glassy concentric circles. "The old woman by the rocks," Lila said, rolling a cigarette between 2 fingers. "She once told me that the sea is like a room. You can put things there. Sometimes you leave a chair. Sometimes you leave a cup. Sometimes you leave a person. The room keeps the shape of what you leave." She took a drag and squinted at the sky. "People talk like it's the island doing it, taking. But maybe it's us who keep filling the space. Maybe we like it being filled." Annie had long suspected as much, that it was not purely place but the conjunction of person and place that made strange things happen. She imagined her own hollowness as an empty vessel, the island as an attentive hand offering to put in something, attention, ritual, a clay token. The prospect was both alluring and terrifying. Storms on coasts have habits like thought. They begin as suggestion and gather mass until the air is a single decision. The weather report that morning used the obligate bureaucratic language of a hazard notice, but the sky's color and the way palms bent toward the inshore made the words unnecessary. Guests scuttled to porches and staff moved with a practiced quickness. The 9 o'clock hush that had become a ritual at the resort took on an anxious edge as clouds rolled in with a sense of something harnessed. Annie felt the storm in her body the way sailors do, a tightening, an ancestral rearrangement that made small tasks urgent. She packed a small satchel with a flashlight, the shell pendant she had found at the veranda weeks before, and the notebook full of her annotations. Her impulses were not purely investigative. They were also impulsive, as if she had found a seam in herself and wanted to see whether the island's curating would seam or tear. Adrian found her by the concierge desk with the map open. Rain had begun as a fine mist, and then moved into a hard, drumming percussion. He did not wear his manager mask. His face was raw with concern. "You shouldn't go," he said simply. His hands were steady, but his voice trembled in the consonants. "When it storms, the shore wakes in different ways. The watchers gather differently." "I don't want to be watched from the safety of the monitors," Annie replied. The answer surprised her with its truth. She had learned in rooms full of microphones and polite applause that being observed from a distance is one way to be alive and another to be dead. Up close, she hoped, would be clarifying. He looked at her for a long minute, and then, in a concession that carried all the weight of time, he reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded piece of paper. "If you go," he said, "bring this back." She unfolded the paper. It was a tracer's note, an old photograph clipped from a ledger, a black and white of 3 figures on the northern sand, ringed in shells and bones, faces turned away. There was a small notation in his father's handwriting at the bottom: "If you give, the sea will learn your shape." "I won't be gone long," she lied. "You always lie that way," he said. But there was no accusation in it. There was only the tiredness of someone who had seen the sea keep too many shapes. The path to the northern cove is narrow and becomes more honest as it moves. Vegetation claws less, and the ground smells increasingly of wet minerals. The wind tore at her lantern and smudged light into ragged halos. The resort lights became other people's memories. She walked in present tense, the jolt of the rain on her face, the pulse of the tide like a carriage, the 3 knocks that sounded somewhere inside her skull. First for pattern, second for warning, third for demand. The shore opened on a horizon that was equal parts horizon and mouth. Figures stood in the surf, ankle-deep, then waist-deep, like a flotilla of fluted statues. Their faces were pale in stormlight, their smiles patient as dawn. They did not move toward her. They held their place the way a tide holds a line. A bell-like undertone vibrated underfoot, a frequency felt more than heard. The sound moved through the soles of her shoes and into the soft place behind her sternum. Annie stopped on the wet sand and felt, strangely, that the figures had known of her approach in advance. It was as if a conversation had been stitching itself against time and had simply arrived at this seam. When she tried to speak, the sound came out thin and not entirely her own. "You are empty," said, not so much voiced as impressed upon her mind. The words were simple and exact, like a diagnosis handed to someone who had come for counsel. The promise, if it can be called a promise, followed quickly. "You can be kept. You can be remembered. You can be filled." At first, the offer made no coercion. It suggested, with the gentleness of a locally appointed authority, that Annie could give something and take something in return. The idea was not of violence, but of being appointed a place in which absence could be made whole. The watchers' smiles were not monstrous. They were the near smiles of people who know how to wait. Something inside her loosened. She thought of the long list of public exchanges that had left her hollow. The televised apology that required her voice to be pitched in contrition, the late-night jokes that reduced her to a caricature. The crowd whose attention was a commodity to be serviced and then removed. The sea's offer shimmered with a simplicity that cut through policy and performative mourning. It asked for a surrender that might be restorative. From the ridge behind her, amid the wind and rain, a shout rose, Adrian's voice, ragged and close. "Annie, don't!" He was running, his coat flapping like a flag. The urgency in his shout was animal. He reached her just as she took a step forward, as if the sea's offer had the force of gravity. There was no single clean moment of heroism. It did not read like a film's rescue. Instead, it read like the tug-of-war that occurs when two kinds of wanting collide. The island's languid patience and a human's frantic refusal to be folded away. Adrian grabbed her arm and held her, palms hard against rain-slick fabric. "Please," he said, "come back with me." The watchers did not move. Their smiles kept their patient geometry. The bell sound swelled. Another presence, an almost sound, deep and like the echo of a conch, pressed against the inside of her skull. For a moment time seemed to inhale. Annie felt the pull of two maps at once. One a map of practical survival, shelter, staff, a way back to shore, and one a map that promised quiet fullness. The island offered to keep her in the place where someone would always notice the missing thing within her and set about gentle repairs. Adrian offered the messy, uncertain work of reintegration, returning to a life where she would still need to answer messages, face cameras, explain, apologize. Which asking would she heed? The choice was not a clear binary. In the pressure of rain against skin and the tactile reality of Adrian's fingers in her coat, she experienced something acute, an awareness that either option demanded a kind of loss. If she stayed, she would be rendered into fewer private contours, but maybe gain a kind of companionship. If she left, she would keep her private edges but live with the ache unresolved. She stepped backward. Not away from the watchers exactly, but toward Adrian's certainty. The movement was a negotiation. As if testing the decision, one of the watchers extended an arm from the water, and with an old slow motion, placed a small shell on the surface like a bowl. The shell caught the light, and for a second seemed to hold all the rain. Adrian saw it and swore, a human sound that blurred into the weather. "Come," he said, and in his voice was something older than his managerial tone, fear, not of publicity, but of loss. They walked back under the storm's tight canopy. The watchers receded into the grey like people into a theatre's dim, their patience intact. When they reached the boardwalk, the three knocks came, one at the veranda, one on the stair landing, one faint and distant, as if on another shore. A small wet footprint pressed onto the top step, and then nothing more. When dawn rose, it did so without fanfare. The storm folded and made its exit with the social decorum of someone who had come to claim a favor and had left it partially granted. The northern cove looked like any sea at dawn, stones and seaweed in a thin mist that blurred the horizon. There was no altar in the pale light. If bones had been there, they were washed away or hidden. The resort resumed its rituals as if nothing of consequence had occurred, but the staff moved more subdued, the air between them tighter. In the days after the storm, the island's official narrative and its private ledger diverged. A press release went out. Elysian Cove experienced adverse weather conditions that temporarily affected guest comforts. Guest safety was our priority. No injuries were reported. The clip of the whitewashed monitor surfaced again online, edited and discussed. The footage that had once held a smiling, pale face now exhibited a smear and an explanatory caption from a tech. Camera sensor error. Sensational threads thinned as moderators and PR teams smoothed corners. Annie left within a week. Her departure was filmed by no one and announced to no one. She paid the bill and took a seaplane back to the city, to the lights and the obligations she had once thought impossible to leave. The question that had accompanied her, the title that now felt like a private talisman, Fear Island, what am I doing here, had become, if anything, more interior than before. It was no longer a demand about logistics. It had become an inventory. What did she carry that made the island look at her twice? When she arrived in her small apartment, the city air tasted like other business. Her phone buzzed with messages. Agents, old acquaintances, one or two headline-thirsty contacts reaching out. She put the shell pendant she had found in a bowl by the sink. She hung her robe on the back of a chair like a relic. For a few nights, she slept with ocean's echo under her pillow. Auditory residue, perhaps, or the ghost of the storm bell. Sometimes she woke in the night with the distinct sense that someone had smiled as she slept. A week into her return, she found a small, wet footprint on the welcome mat at her door. It was the same childlike press she had come to know. Toes splayed, inner arch shallow. The print was slightly faded, damp as if someone had come by in the rain and placed a foot and gone. She could have chalked it up to a prank or a mislaid courier. She scrubbed the mat and sat on the stair and watched the footprint dry into its shape on the fibers, as if it were a bruise. The effect of seeing the mark in her real life was disorienting, a domesticization of the island's taste. Over the months that followed, fragments of the island followed her back like stowaways. A shell would be found in the pocket of a coat she had not worn since Elysian. The low, bell-like sound would return at odd hours, a distant vibration she could feel against her teacup, the faint resonance beneath subway noise. Her friends noticed a change. She laughed less, as if saving laughter for a strict accounting. Some of them asked if she had been on holiday. None asked the question that pulsed underneath. Did it take anything from you? There were attempts to make the island legible to others. An independent filmmaker contacted her months later with a measured, hungry proposal. An intimate documentary about isolation and place, a chance to speak on camera about the experience and the social currency of fame. Annie agreed with reluctance. The attraction of being seen for truth, rather than spectacle, was a new calculus. The film's crew arrived with small lights and small questions. They asked for details. Times, sounds, the sequence of knocks, and she complied in the way of someone who knows the shape of a confession will alter it. The documentary footage included short excerpts from the resort's public statements and an overlay of security log timestamps. There were a few frames where, with brightness adjusted and contrast pulled, the white smear resolved into suggestion, an oval of pale in which a face might be imagined. The film's director included a clip of Adrian speaking into a camera, hesitant and pale. We gave every statement we had. We do not know what happened. The statement was careful enough for a lawyer, raw enough for a film. The media cycle that followed was not as voracious as Annie had expected. Elysian Cove's name circulated, then was folded into lifestyle pieces about off-the-grid luxury. The island reopened with a glossy brochure and a restraining legal note. Tourists posted sunlit photos, verandas and cocktails, and the coy pronouncement, "A place to disappear." Comment threads were divided between romanticization and fear. Somewhere in those oppositions the island found its public grammar, a little frightening, a lot luxurious. Meanwhile, in private, the traces multiplied in subtle forms. She would misplace a habit, folding napkins the wrong way, and then later find them arranged as if by another's hands. Sometimes, while speaking on a panel, she would pause, distracted by a small internal echo, the bell sound, the undernote of the sea reminding her of a moment when a face smiled in an archived camera frame. Her world had been slightly enlarged and slightly hollowed. The island had inserted an interior guest into her day. Therapy sessions followed, as they often do for people trying to digest public disaster and private grief. Annie sat on a couch in a room with soft lighting and tried to use language that would translate the experience into measurable terms. The therapist listened and offered the kind of scaffolding professionals do. Trauma is not only what happens to the body, but what is made to live in memory. You are allowed to feel both pulled and repelled, she said. There were exercises, breathing, reconnection, naming the boundaries between self and place. Annie practiced them with a mechanical diligence that sometimes felt like rehearsal for a public performance. In short vignettes over the following months, staff members offered their own half-muted testimonies. Lila left the resort after a year, saying nothing more than she needed to be somewhere quieter. Felipe took a position on a neighboring island. Adrian stayed, tending to the resort in a manner like tending a church, careful, reticent, with a ledger of things he could not explain. Once, in a filmed interview conducted for the documentary, he confessed to keeping a list in an old envelope. Names of guests who had left, and strange, small changes he'd noticed. Habits swapped, silence deepened, necklaces missing and then appearing. He would not say whether the list represented damage or meaning. "We are not the island," he said, "but we notice what it does." Annie's life adapted to the island's signatures like a ship that learns an unanticipated current. She instituted small rituals at home, a bowl for shells by the door, an evening where she would sit and listen to recorded waves. Sometimes she found comfort in the idea that a place might hold the missing seams for people. Other times, she felt an erase of self happening slow and patient. She made compromises in public, an interview where she used the word retreat, a magazine essay about the necessity of being unseen, but always the undercurrent surfaced, a private ownership or theft, depending on how she looked at it. On an afternoon months later, when winter rain tapped the city windows with a clean, improvised rhythm, Annie received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a grainy photograph, a black and white shot of the northern cove, a small ring of shells, and a pendant laid in the center. Written on the back, in a hand that might have been Adrian's and might have been someone else's, was one sentence: "The sea remembers absence." The photograph made her hands shake in a way she could not entirely attribute to nostalgia. She pressed the paper into a drawer and later took it out and read the sentence aloud until the sound of it in her own mouth made the thought less solitary. The island persisted in her life as a metaphor and as a physical trace. Years do what years always do. They anneal and reveal. Annie's public life resumed with the inevitable choreography of image management and career repair. She returned to stages and panels and the rituals of a public that still loved to watch. She worked with a small team to manage appearances and to dampen speculation. Yet at night, between travel and script, the hollow in her ribcage sometimes felt less echoing and more furnished. On good nights, the maritime sound that had once been an intrusive bell now thinned into memory. On bad nights, she would awake to the sense of a smile at the edge of recognition. The documentary was released in a modest festival season, where it drew both praise for its quiet restraint and criticism for leaving questions unresolved. Critics called it a study in atmosphere. Viewers debated whether the film had been exploitative or necessary. Elysian Cove's PR released a single updated statement. "The resort remains committed to safe, private stays. We regret any discomfort felt by guests and continue to review our operations." The language was familiar, soft, indemnifying. The island, as if courteous, remained inscrutable. There were moments of small, uncanny public evidence that the island's influence did not end at the shore. An article quoted a guest who returned with the inexplicable tendency to leave little plates of shells in unexpected places. A columnist wrote a whimsical piece about the return of trophy absence in luxury travel, the idea that missing pieces can be curated. The internet parsed the story into hashtags and banners. The island remained for most an afternoon's curiosity, but for Annie, the consequences were less digestible to headlines. In the months after her return, she noticed changes in how she allowed herself to be recognized. On stage, she would sometimes pause, feeling the old, hollowed place like a soft muscle that had learned to contract. She found herself saying less and listening more, not from a new humility, but from a concern that words might be the sort of thing the island catalogued most greedily. In private, she began to practice denying easy satisfactions, not replying instantly to messages, refusing quick apologies, allowing silence to be a thing with teeth. These were small acts of self-protection that felt both necessary and insufficient. Late one spring evening, a year after the storm, Annie opened her front door to find a single wet footprint on her hallway runner and a shell threaded on a frayed cord lying beside it. The footprint was faint, like something that had been there and almost chosen to fade. She picked up the pendant and held it in her palm. The shell smelled like salt and something older. For a minute she felt her resistance thin. She imagined the island as a mouth that had once offered and now watched to see whether she would accept. She did not know if acceptance would mean the same as surrender. Perhaps it did. Perhaps openness does not equal oblivion. Perhaps it means choosing a different kind of living. The island's offer, or perceived offer, remained ambiguous. Over time, Annie discovered that ambiguity could be lived with. A daily negotiation rather than a final verdict. In the end, the question that had begun as a literal one, "What am I doing here?" became for her a ritualized inward checking. She would sometimes whisper it to herself while standing by a window, watching rain make its own grammar on glass. The question was no longer solely about place. It was about what she allowed to be given and what she refused. It asked whether attention was currency she wanted to trade or an inheritance to steward. On a quiet evening, months turned into years, the island's signatures still came in small parcels. She kept a jar of shells on her windowsill, a quiet museum of moments. There were times when the bell sound would visit, not as intrusion, but as a kind of reminder that absence had weight. At other times, the sound would be sharp enough to make her set down a cup and breathe. Once, while the documentary was being considered for a small award, she received a short, anonymous message that read, "Some islands are patient enough to teach people how to be full." The message could have been sent by a fan or a former employee. It could have been the island itself. She folded the note and carried it in her wallet like a talisman, useful when the world felt too loud, when the public's gaze demanded she occupy a single shape. She learned to live with the knowledge that some part of her had been seen in a way she could not manufacture or control. The island had not, crucially, taken her from life. It had made an arrangement with something inside her, a reallocation of attention. For some time she measured the trade as loss. Over longer time she measured it as something else, a reweaving of self around new patterns, some of which were tender, some of which were frightening. The final image of her time with Elysian Cove is almost small and domestic. On a grey afternoon she returned from an appointment to find, pressed gently onto the runner at her doorway, a small wet footprint, and threaded on the mat's edge, a pale shell pendant. She looked at it and then looked at the city beyond her window, the sound of traffic, the hum of human schedule, and she asked the question out loud for herself and not for strangers. Fear Island. What am I doing here? This time the question was an instrument. It was not the plaint of a person asking permission to leave, it was a charter of her interior life. The sea had remembered her absence and had proposed an answer. She had declined, or partly declined, or accepted on terms she would not entirely name. She would carry its signatures like a scar one keeps for the lesson. Attention given is attention taken. Love can be careful and also erasing. To be seen can be both balm and theft. She picked up the shell and held it to her ear. The sound she heard was not simply of sea, but of the suite of things that circumstance had made possible. The way a person becomes a place's witness. The manner in which a place teaches people about the shapes they leave behind, the slow exchange between hunger and care. The footprint dried on her runner and then lifted away, as if it had been a passing weather. Outside, in the world that moved past her window, a travel piece about an island resort ran its own tidy notes. People would visit in time, and the island would continue its patient business. Inside her apartment, Annie set the shell upon a small shelf, and for reasons both tender and terrified, began to arrange the things around it with care. The act was not a resignation. It was a decision about how to exist alongside the forms of attention that had marked her. In the quiet that followed, the question that had begun as an arrival's exclamation, "What am I doing here?" changed pitch. It became a quieter examination one asks of oneself in rooms with good light. Am I here to be filled by others, or to learn how to hold my own furniture? The island offered one answer. The city offered another. Annie kept both in her hands like two small stones and felt their temperature. The last note of the story is less revelation than posture. Annie continued to work, to speak at events, to be photographed and edited and loved in complicated ways. She continued to take calls from producers and to decline invitations she did not need. Sometimes she slept with the bell under her pillow as an echo, sometimes she slept without it. The footprints appeared over the years as small imprints on a mat, in a rain puddle outside a cafe, a faint smear on a book jacket. They were reminders rather than omens. On the day she finally agreed to speak at a small memorial for displaced people, she stood before a modest crowd and, in a voice that had learned to keep its edges, said something that could be read any number of ways. The places that see us can also try to own us. It is our work to choose which gazes shape us and which we resist. When you ask where you are, be willing to answer and to change the question when the time comes. Afterward, when the room had emptied, a young woman approached her and said quietly, "Have you ever been to Elysian?" Annie looked at her, at the earnest line of the woman's face, and then at the shell on the small chain at her throat. "Once," she said. "It noticed me." The woman held the sentence as if it were a map. She nodded and left. Annie closed the door, and in the silence allowed herself for the briefest span to rehearse the old refrain. Fear Island. What am I doing here? She smiled then, not purely in mirth, but in the way one might smile when acknowledging a complicated truth. The sea remembers absence. Some absences remain open. Some are tended. Some are returned in the smallest of offerings. A shell on a mat, a footprint on a doorstep. Annie kept her life by naming what she would accept and what she would not, by keeping a small jar of shells and by turning occasionally as if in prayer to a question that had once been shouted into the wind and had never quite stopped answering. If you are curious about slow places and the ways they collect us, subscribe for more stories that ask what happens when a place looks back.